I just have a PDF, so
Okay, that's cool too.
this is okay. And you can
Yeah,
see the
that's
whole screen. And you don't
totally.
see my email instead.
No, we're all good. Yeah, we know we're good with the with the PDF. So I'm going to kick it over to Justin. Justin is with Miles, and he works on their SEO, and in fact, some of our SEO. So take it away, Justin.
Cool, thank you. And thank you guys for joining today. Today's presentation is going to be a little bit more brief than the presentation we have scheduled later that is going to go into a little bit more advanced topics. But for today, we just wanted to really talk about SEO 101 and the four main pillars of SEO. So there's really like four large things you need to kind of think about when you're trying to optimize your website and increase that organic visibility for your site. And those pillars are your technical SEO, your on-page optimization, which is like you trying to target each page for individual keywords, the content itself, which is obviously what is ranking, and then link building or your backlink profile. So we're really just going to talk about each of these at a high level today, and then we will have lots more details and good stuff in the next presentation. So here's technical SEO. So technical SEO is essentially just making sure that Google can actually crawl the website that you're presenting them. I know that sounds kind of like obvious, but a lot of times what'll happen when you either have a new website launched or maybe you're working with a different CMS that has configurations set up a certain way is that you'll accidentally end up with settings that tell Google not to crawl your website and not to index it. And it's something that, it's really easy to overlook. You'll see it really often in new site launches. And sometimes you'll just see it when you create new pages. So making sure that that's not happening, making sure that your website loads in a decent amount of time, mobile friendliness. So making sure that your website can actually load on all of the different devices that you might be serving your content to. JavaScript rendering is not something that you always have to worry about, but it is something that a lot of times, like you might be given a widget, or you might be like maybe you install a plugin or something to try and make some of your functionality a little bit better. And kind of on accident, what you can end up doing is presenting your content in JavaScript format instead of an HTML format. And the problem with that is that Google takes several tries for them to render your content when it's written in JavaScript. And so they just can't index your content as quickly as you might like. They do eventually render it, but it takes them several tries. And so when you publish something new, maybe you have something that's more timely, news piece, or just something that's, kind of time relevant, you might publish that, and then it might take Google several weeks to actually index it because it's not rendered in HTML. But there's an easy way to check for that. Canonical URL tags. This is when you are declaring what the original source of a piece of content is. And so in a typical situation, your website would just self-reference itself, or your pages, I should say, would self-reference themselves with these canonical URL tags. However, there's a lot of cases, especially in the travel space or in the DMO space, where you might actually be borrowing or sharing some content that's either identical or very, very similar, and it's kind of borrowed from a different source. And in that case, you don't want to get in trouble for having duplicate content, and you don't want to take away the credibility from the website that supplied that content to you if you're borrowing something. And so you implement something called a canonical URL, and that gives credit back to the original source. For the most part, like I said, these would be self-referencing, but a lot of times we end up with like landing pages that are, maybe they're for media and you're trying out some like variables, or you're doing some A/B testing, and you don't want those specific landing pages indexed. You just want the original page indexed. And so you'd use a canonical URL to tell Google, hey, like we know that we have pages A, B, and C on the website, and they look a lot like page D. Page D is the one that we want really indexed. We don't want these other ones indexed. And so you just implement a canonical. That should be default in most content management systems. So it's not something that you're always going to be having to really create. It should be there on its own, but it's something to keep in mind if you're publishing content, you should know that it's there. Your sitemaps. So the sitemap.xml file is very important. If you're using WordPress, you might be using a program called Yoast SEO, which is just super common. Most small businesses do use WordPress with the Yoast SEO plugin. I see that as probably the most commonly occurring configuration with most people. And it actually creates these by default for you if you're using that setup. So what this does is these sitemaps just tell Google what to crawl. Google will naturally crawl everything on your website as it just follows the links, but there may be stuff that you want it to crawl specifically. And there might be certain pieces of content or pages that get updated more regularly. And so what you can do in the sitemaps is define like, hey, we have this event calendar. It gets updated every single day. It actually gets updated multiple times a day. And so you can tell Google to crawl this page daily or multiple times a day, or at least you can ask it. Nobody can tell Google to do anything. But by doing that, you're suggesting that they revisit this specific page regularly so that any new events that you might be publishing gets picked up as often as possible. And kind of counter to that, there might be pages like a privacy policy or like an About Us page, stuff that's really going to be the same for the year. Then you don't need Google to spend its time crawling that because you want to make sure that it's crawling the new stuff. And so you can tell Google in your sitemaps not to crawl those, but once every quarter, once every year, however often you're updating those pages. And so that you can kind of create like this priority of how Google is crawling your website and how often. And that way you make sure that your most important content is really getting indexed and crawled as often as possible. Again, if you're using that Yoast SEO plugin or any SEO plugins that work with the sitemaps, which I would say, in doing a lot of these seminars, probably 75+% of people use that configuration. There's very easy in the settings you can go in, and I'll cover the how to do it in the next session. But it's very simple to go in and just tell Google how often to crawl those pages. Now, that brings me to robots.txt. This is just a text file that lives on your website. This is where you would tell Google like explicitly, do not crawl certain areas of my website. There's things like assets, like your JavaScript again, or like CSS files that you may not need to be indexed, but Google still finds all of that stuff while it's crawling around. And so you just have to, you might want to make sure that certain pages aren't being crawled, and you would define that in your robots.txt file. Maybe you have like a paywall and there's certain content that only people who are subscribed to your service or your subscription, only they can receive that content, right? And so you don't need that to show up in Google. That's another area where you might just block a certain area on your website, entirely and say, Google, do not crawl this area of the website. For international targeting, we have something called an href language tag, which essentially just tells Google or other search engines, hey, we have page A, that is the primary content piece for things to do in the English language. But we also, we work in Spanish markets, we work in Japanese markets, and we want to know what are those respective pages for those foreign language pages, right? And so there are something called href lang tags that will say, if you're speaking English, and that is the default language for our website, this is the page URL. If you're now coming from a market that speaks Spanish or Japanese, etc., these are those respective URLs. So just make sure that you crawl those pages too, so that people in those markets can also receive the same content when they're Googling. And so the international targeting, it's not obviously going to be relevant to everybody because not everybody is targeting those international or foreign language markets, but it is very important for those who are to make sure that it can show up in Google, Google Mexico, Google Japan, etc. The HTML structure of your website is also very important because that is actually what Google is crawling. And so I'll touch on this a little bit in the next couple pages, but making sure that you have the very basic tags set up. your title tags, your meta descriptions, your heading tags, using those in the way that they are intended to be used. This is exactly, this is what Google crawls as the HTML of your website. And so structuring that in a way that allows Google to kind of parse things out and make sense of them together by using heading tags. And then, because if you use an H tag, which is a heading tag, and you say, you should expect this content below, it knows that now the content below that block is explicitly about what that heading kind of declared. Now, again, that kind of sounds obvious, but what a lot of people will end up doing for stylistic reasons is using like bold tags, or just kind of using the WYSIWYG to increase the size of the font to create headings. And visually that might be okay, but it just doesn't allow Google to receive the context behind those keywords because you're not structuring it correctly. Finally, we have something called schema.org. And I would say this is more of like a bonus, where everything else up here is really a necessity. Schema is, it's not new, but it's new-ish to the SEO world. Probably new within the last like 10 or so years. So new-ish. But what schema is a form of structured data that allows Google to really definitively understand everything that you're talking about. Because right now, Google and any other search engine is essentially just reading text and kind of translating it and making a lot of great assumptions about what that content is probably about. We think it's probably an event because we see a venue mentioned and we see a date, and we think, and we can see like a performer, and we think that this is probably an event, but we can't be certain. With schema.org, you can definitively lay out all of the events that you have, and it gives you some really neat features within Google and the other search engines. And those are rich snippets and the inclusion of your content in Google's event calendar. So for DMOs, the event markup, I'll keep speaking of events because for large DMOs, like events do drive so much traffic, and the event markup specifically is one of the more important ones. I would argue it's the most important schema type. It allows us to get these rich snippets, which if I were to say like things to do in Denver today, or I'm in Denver, by the way, so I like to be self-referential, but or like Denver events, you can actually get this rich snippet block below your Google listing that has the next 3 most upcoming events underneath that listing, so that you can actually click directly into them from the Google like greater event listing page and get deeper into the content. Something that we've noticed at Miles is that it really helps to increase the click-through rates in the search engine results, because you just have such a larger snippet in Google. But aside from that, what's really cool about it is that for things like, again, for events, if I Google the name of a venue, I'm not looking for a specific event and I'm just looking for a venue, it will actually show me what events are coming to that venue based on websites like DMO websites now. It doesn't have to pull from the venue's website specifically. It knows, because it has this structured data on it, that, hey, this event here that Louisiana is trying to promote, it actually exists at this venue over here. And so when people Google this venue, now our event lists can show up underneath their knowledge graph card. And so that is a very cool way to just syndicate a lot of your content out and like help it get discovered when people aren't even necessarily searching for it. And so I say this is a bonus, but if you are hosting a lot of events, I would say that it's something I would definitely work to getting implemented on your website. Okay, so that's technical stuff. We're looking at crawlability. We're looking at making sure that Google crawls what we want them to crawl and not what they just stumble upon on their own. We're making sure that we're targeting those international markets when that's relevant to us. We're making sure that our site loads in 3 seconds or less, and we're making sure that our website is friendly on mobile devices. But all of that, won't do anything if we're not really targeting the specific keywords that we want to rank for. And so a lot of people might put on-page optimization and content in the same bucket when we talk about pillars. I'm breaking them out separately because the on-page optimization is really that targeting that you're going to be doing. And so if you do have a page that's, let's say it's things to do in Louisiana, it's the landing page, and that's the keyword that you're targeting. You're going to want to make sure that that keyword or some very closely semantically related version of that keyword is targeted specifically in your title tag, your meta description, your headings, your H1, H2, etc. And those headings go all the way out to H6. Your alt tags, your image file names, your captions, somewhere in the paragraph text or the content, obviously, and in your anchor text of your inbound and outbound links that you're using on those pages. And something I don't have mentioned here, because we don't always have as acute control of this, is the URLs. It's very nice to have your focus keyword written out in your URL like verbatim. Now, with a lot of content management systems, like if you're trying to optimize for a specific keyword and you already have a page that's been live for a long time, it's usually best to just leave that page alone and not change the URL, because when we do a lot of URL changes, we can really confuse the search engine. You know, they know that they had page A and they try and visit it, and now it's gone because somebody changed that URL. Now you're effectively starting over. You can create redirects. You can use something called a 301 redirect to tell them that, hey, now page A is now page B, but you have to make sure that you are intentionally doing that. And that's just an area that I see that often gets overlooked when people do change their URL names. And so their URLs. And so I wouldn't say that that one's as important if you're optimizing a page, but when you're creating a new page, I would certainly keep that in mind. If you can keep that core focus keyword in the URL when you can, do it. But if you're optimizing after the fact, then you may not. All right, so then let's look at our content, because the content really is what's getting ranked. You know, they're not ranking you purely because you have a website. It is because Google is trying to answer people's questions, and they're assuming that you have the best answer for that question. So when you create content, you're really going to want to think about it with some kind of hierarchy in mind. Back to the things to do idea or reference, there's a lot of things to do in Louisiana. And so you might want to start off with broad parent topics and create things to do. And then you have indoor activities, outdoor activities, events, you know, blah, 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 etc. And so we start focusing on outdoor activities. And then from outdoor activities, you might have a page about mountain biking. And from there, you might actually create like a really long tail piece of content about what to wear while you're mountain biking, or how to change your tire in 3 steps, because people who are visiting your state will probably get a flat tire. Like that happens. And so you create this hierarchy of like broad content that is stuff that we want to promote. And then nested underneath that is really specific pieces of content that answer people's questions who are really into those topics. And so it might be changing your tires, or what to wear, because you know it might rain on you and you might get stuck out there miles from home without your rain jacket or without water. And all of that becomes important for people who are actually gearing up to go on these bike rides, but also for people who are just generally Googling. They may not specifically be looking for Louisiana bike trails, but if you can answer that question about how to change a tire or what to pack while you're out on a trip, and then it's coming from the DMO, you can kind of start to target some of those, bigger awareness, or you can target people in that awareness stage a little bit better, because now you're answering their questions. So just kind of always think about content in like some sort of hierarchical fashion whenever you're creating it, but then when you're adding it to your navigation and your landing pages. And finally is link building. So again, these are the 4 like pillars, right? We have technical, we have the on-page targeting, the meat of the website, which is the content, and then the link building. And so the link building is the other like why. Like there are millions, if not billions, of websites out there in the world. Why should Google rank you instead of somebody else who has similar content? And one of the big major factors is backlinks. And so people from other websites who have links that point back to your website are kind of like a vouch of truth, or of it. It gives Google confidence that your website is like a very valid website and a very good source of information about this topic. So when you're building backlinks, and this is, I noted at the bottom, this is probably the most difficult and time-consuming aspect of SEO. But when you are building these backlinks, make sure that you use anchor text that's relevant to the page that you are linking back to, and also your core mission. So if you're looking to attract people who are just looking for Louisiana vacations, you might use that as the anchor text, Louisiana vacations, that points back to the homepage. But if I'm looking for like mountain biking in Louisiana, then I might want to use that specific keyword as the anchor text that goes back to my mountain biking page. And the more you build of those, the more that Google sees these signals of, here's a link that says this. It says mountain biking in Louisiana, and it links back to their mountain biking page. Google kind of gets an idea like, okay, this is a pretty valid page for this topic, because we have all of these other websites linking back to us with very similar anchor text about mountain biking. For DMOs and anyone in the travel space, and really anybody on the web, your partnerships are going to be the place to go to really start to start this process. This is where we found is the easiest way to scale your link building efforts. And usually they're the most relevant people to link to you anyways. So I really would encourage you guys, if you have partnerships, you should link to them in like resource pages, and they should be linking to you, whether that's like in the footer link if you're a DMO, or if you're a tourism, or if you're more of like a travel guide or a tour operator, maybe you have resource pages that link back to them, and vice versa. And you kind of create a web of interlinking websites that now look like they're all a little bit more authoritative, because they're not just out there on an island. So I know I kind of breezed through some of this. Just to kind of summarize though, there's 4 main things that you want to look at when you're talking about SEO and trying to increase your rankings. It's the, can I crawl it? Is my page optimized for a specific key term? Do I have content that answers people's questions about this topic? And do I have backlinks that link out to me, back to my website, that kind of validates me? If you're interested in doing like more research into this on your own independently, they're the Moz.com. They have a beginner's guide to SEO resource. So if you want to write that down, or we can send it in follow up. But I've always kind of referred people to the Moz beginner's guide, because I think they do a great job of breaking out all the different topics. You'll notice a lot of what I'm talking about here is broken out in their resource, and it just talks about all of this stuff in a lot more depth, and really gets into the meat of some of these things. So that's a great resource to go to. It's totally free. Moz is a really great company in terms of SEO tools, but really in terms of SEO education. They put on a great, well, it used to be in person, but a great conference every year where they bring in all sorts of different people from every different industry and talk about how they've found success with SEO. And just they used to do something called Whiteboard Fridays. They may still do that. I haven't been watching them as often anymore, but Whiteboard Fridays is another really great source. They call in somebody from a different organization every week. Sometimes it's internal, and they just cover one topic in like 15, 20 minutes for SEO. So kind of a great like Friday morning, drink your coffee and watch the Whiteboard Fridays. I used to really enjoy watching those myself for many years. And that puts us at about 30 minutes. So I don't know if we were going to do questions or anything, but thank you for everybody who joined.
Hey, Justin, it's Teresa. Quick question. So that's Moz, MOZ.com, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm curious. I do have a question regarding backlinks. So, like LouisianaTravel.com has a lot of of listings on the site. And one of the website rules for that is that the listings require a website URL. So even something as simple as your website listings will, if I understand it correctly, will help provide backlinks to your industry partners, right?
Yeah, correct.
So that's like a benefit. So say, I know Rustin is on the call. So the Rustin CVB website requires those, a website URL as part of being listed on their website. They could actually think of that as an industry, a benefit to their industry members. And then they could ask for that reciprocally. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, the DMO, I mean, and that's another great thing is the DMOs have really high authority. I can't tell you what Louisiana's in off the top of my head, but it's usually in the 50 plus, 50 out of 100, which it's a logarithmic. The way they score this, if I say 50 out of 100, it sounds like an F, but that's actually very, very high in terms of web authority scores. But the DMOs always have very high authority scores. So any kind of backlinks from a DMO back to your own business website is very valuable. And the bigger the DMO, kind of the more value they seem to provide.
Is there any kind of a free website authority checker you could recommend, or is that a Moz thing?
These tools. So for those on the call, if you guys wanted a quick check, it takes me about a minute to run it. So in follow up, if anybody was interested in that, we could pull that and I could explain that. I'll explain the backlinks and domain authority and how that works in a little bit more depth for the next call. But we usually have like 40 to 60. Of course, it's a big range, right? I think Louisiana's is in the 50 range, but 40 to 60 is usually where the DMOs are, with the best, which is like a couple that I've seen, being in the 80 range, but it's super rare. For anybody though, I always say if you can get your website into the mid 30s or 40 range, that's where you can start making small tweaks and seeing bigger impacts. If you're a small website and you sit in the lower like 20 range, you're not going to really see a huge impact making small tweaks to your website until you build out that authority. So it's kind of a balance between all of these pillars, but they're all very, very important.
Cool. Any questions, anything else from anyone? I didn't see any come through in the chat, so I think we're probably okay. We're at around 11:32, which is kind of where we're aiming for these guys to wrap up. And I'm still not seeing any questions, so I think we're okay. Thanks to everybody for coming and attending, and for hopefully watching this streaming afterwards on our industry portal. Again, check out the industry portal for more upcoming sessions, including the intermediate or more advanced SEO that Justin's referring to that we'll do in the future. And that URL again is louisianatravel.com/industry. And that is where we host all of our registration links for these webinars and our recordings of past webinars and a full lineup of what's to come, as well as some other free educational resources and other tools that are available to all of our partners, including outside of CVBs, some of our like attractions associations and other folks that we work with in the industry. So be sure to take a look, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.